Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming back to this channel. Before we begin, make sure you're safe, because tonight's story isn't just a horror story, it's real. On this channel, we discuss dark, mysterious, and unexplained events. Now, let's begin. This dispatch recording reveals a final warning. The tape emerged during a major equipment cleanup in early November 2010 when a junior technician named Corbin Weller sorted an old storage closet in a small mountain dispatch station near a quiet highway. He expected dust and broken headsets, yet he found a battered reel marked Night Alert with a smeared date that suggested years of neglect. Corbin planned to toss anything unreadable, but the careful handwriting on the label felt intentional enough to keep him curious. He waited until his shift ended before loading the tape into an aging player in the break room. The audio crackled twice before locking into a clear channel that carried the steady voice of dispatcher Rowan Pike, who had worked overnight duty for years without incident. His calm tone described routine conditions on the Ridge Road with dry pavement and light wind that made the route easy for travelers. A ranger named Tessa Rourke checked in from the overlooked turnout where she monitored late traffic for safety concerns. Her voice carried the relaxed confidence of someone who treated the mountain as familiar ground rather than difficult terrain, even during long, quiet hours. 6 minutes into the recording, Rowan asked about a faint tapping behind her speech that sounded like metal nudged at a slow rhythm under shifting pressure. Tessa paused, then admitted she heard it too, although she believed it came from a loose drainage grate near the turnout that often rattled after dusk. She dismissed the sound as ordinary maintenance trouble while assuring him she would inspect it soon. Rowan accepted her answer, yet the tapping continued with steady timing that broke from typical weather patterns and made him uneasy despite his training. The tape captured a slight tremble in her radio as the tapping grew sharper, as if something heavy pressed against the grate with deliberate force. Rowan told her to stay alert because the pattern felt too precise for random vibration. She agreed while stepping back toward her patrol truck with boots crunching over cold gravel. The microphone picked up her breathing, which turned fast and shallow once the tapping stopped without any fading interval. She whispered that she sensed movement beyond the tree line, though she could not yet identify size or shape. Rowan asked for details, and her answer arrived in a tense, quiet tone that carried controlled fear. She said a tall, narrow figure stood between two pines with a posture that looked too still for any animal she recognized along these routes. She insisted the shape did not sway with the wind and seemed angled toward her position in a watching stance. Rowan instructed her to get inside her vehicle and lock the doors until he contacted the closest ranger for support. She acknowledged him, then moved quickly with clear urgency. Her door slammed on the audio and the engine rumbled through the static as she locked every entry. She reported that the figure now stood behind her truck, though still out of direct light. A slow scrape crept across the microphone like metal dragging on painted steel as something brushed her tailgate. Rowan demanded a clear description once she raised her spotlight toward the rear window. Her breath caught as the beam hit the figure, which shifted instantly toward the forest, with unnatural speed that she described as wrong for any human motion she had seen on duty. The figure vanished among the trees without sound, which unsettled Rowan more than the earlier tapping. He tried to calm her while confirming that backup needed 15 minutes to reach the turnout. The tape held a long, silent stretch where only the hum of her engine filled the channel. Tessa finally said she felt watched again, though she could not see any movement between the trees because the darkness felt too thick for her spotlight. Rowan kept her talking, so she stayed grounded, but her voice remained strained. A deep thud echoed through the microphone, and she claimed the ground seemed to pulse beneath her boots before she entered the vehicle. Rowan asked her to repeat that because he thought he misheard, but she insisted the soil shifted in a slow wave under the gravel. He tried to rationalize the thud as settling rock common in cold mountain regions, though his tone betrayed doubt. She said the pulse traveled in a direction rather than spreading evenly, which made her believe something moved beneath the turnout. The recording grew distorted as she whispered that the figure returned, though now it stood beside a tree much closer to her passenger door. Rowan called her name with sharp urgency while she scrambled for better visibility through the window. A sudden metallic impact rang through the microphone, followed by a short cry that cut off with chilling abruptness. Static flooded the audio, then dissolved into hollow silence, while the engine continued to idle steadily. Rowan repeated her name several times without response, and finally switched channels to call for immediate assistance. Backup reached the turnout with lights sweeping across frost-covered ground. They found her truck idling with the driver door wide open and her radio placed carefully on the seat. No footprints or drag marks circled the vehicle despite soft frost that should have recorded every movement. The official report suggested she chased a possible trespasser into the forest and became disoriented, which local volunteers quietly disputed after helping with extended searches that revealed no trace of her anywhere near the ridge or the play. Lower trails. Corbin listened to the tape twice more before admitting he felt nervous inside the break room, even with fluorescent lights above him. He believed she encountered a trespasser, but could not explain the absence of tracks or the underground pulse she described with steady clarity. He investigated the drainage grate during his next shift, yet found no height or depth that matched the deep thud carried on the recording. The grate showed no damage and no signs of forced pressure that could create rhythmic tapping. He brought the tape to his supervisor, who sealed it inside a locked archive drawer scheduled for regional review. 2 days later, the drawer held no tape and no sign that it had ever been checked out. The supervisor assumed a filing error, yet Corbin found no similar reel anywhere in the station. His only comfort came from a private digital copy he made during the initial playback out of habit rather than suspicion. During late shifts, he sometimes heard faint tapping under the dispatch floor during quiet hours. He dismissed the sound as old pipes adjusting to cold air, though the taps followed the same slow rhythm he remembered from the tape. Each time the tapping stopped sharply, the room filled with tense silence, identical to the moment before her final warning. Corbin avoided mentioning these incidents because he feared they would sound like imagination rather than observation. Months passed before he rewatched the digital copy and realized something new. The final second before the static carried a soft breath from outside the truck rather than inside. The breath sounded deep, steady, and close to the microphone, as if someone leaned near the open door with calm patience. The breath ended with a faint step that barely registered through the static, but held weight that did not match her lighter movements captured earlier. Years later, the digital copy remains the only surviving record of that night because the original tape never resurfaced. Corbin keeps the file on a single encrypted drive that he rarely opens because the final breath unsettles him more than any other part of the recording. He believes the breath matters because it proves someone stood beside her truck before the static claimed the channel, which means her last fear was not imagined but observed. The quiet truth behind that railroad service tunnel. Dispatch logs from a rural county reportedly flagged a strange pattern that focused on an old tunnel near a maintenance siding. Those logs hinted at a series of calls that described footsteps inside the tunnel when no workers were scheduled to be there. Ferran Coyle was a 36-year-old track inspector who handled routine checks along a tired freight corridor that bordered pine scrub and scattered ranch properties. He arrived before sunrise on a cool morning in late 1999 with a simple plan to confirm reported drainage issues near the north entrance of the tunnel. He expected a quick inspection followed by a standard form filed at the small depot office. He parked his truck near the faded signal tower and slung his gear bag over one shoulder, while the sky turned slowly from deep blue to dull gray. He walked toward the tunnel mouth with the usual confidence of someone who had spent years inside tight places and decaying structures. His boots crunched evenly on gravel that clicked against the rust-stained rails. The plan changed after he spotted a narrow streak of mud across a maintenance door set into the concrete wall beside the entrance. He knew that door should have been sealed 2 months earlier after an internal order directed crews to retire a forgotten tool alcove behind it. The instructions were clear on company records that the alcove had become unsafe after repeated washouts and was not to be opened again. Ferran crouched to study the door and saw fresh scuff marks near the bottom that looked like someone had scraped something heavy across the frame. A thin line of water traced down from the latch and darkened the gravel below. He listened for movement and heard a faint tap that sounded like metal striking stone somewhere inside the tunnel where darkness gathered like a heavy curtain. Witness accounts from workers who had used the tunnel in earlier years mentioned odd sounds during night shifts that resembled a slow dragging rhythm. Those older reports were never confirmed by supervisors and were often dismissed as stress-induced hearing fatigue. Farhan had always believed those stories held small grains of truth that deserved respect. He opened his notebook and wrote a quick timestamp, followed by a simple description of the muddy door. He raised a small portable recorder and pressed the warn button to capture ambient noise that pulsed through the tunnel. The tap grew stronger, as if echoing against a deeper chamber. The sound pattern matched older recordings stored in a dusty cabinet at the depot that he had reviewed the previous winter. Farhan unlatched the maintenance door and stepped inside the alcove that smelled strongly of wet soil and neglected machinery. The beam from his flashlight struck rows of rusted tool hooks lining the walls. Several hooks were empty, even though inventory sheets claimed every item had been removed during the official closure. A slim track wrench lay on the ground near the far corner with a layer of clean grit across half its handle that suggested it had been dropped recently. He examined the floor and found a thin trail of dark sludge that continued toward a narrow gap behind a leaning support panel. The panel looked as if someone had shoved it aside with a steady and deliberate force. Farhan moved closer and felt cool air rising through the gap with slow, steady pulses, like weak breaths drifting through broken stone. He radioed the depot office and reported a possible breach in the sealed alcove. The dispatcher asked him to hold position until a second inspector arrived from a yard 20 miles south. Farhan agreed, yet continued recording his surroundings because the tap inside the tunnel had grown into a hollow knocking pattern that sounded too rhythmic to be wind-driven. He pushed the panel aside and revealed a small cavity that workers had once used to route cables during upgrades that took place in the early 1980s. That cavity appeared larger than official diagrams showed and extended into a sloping passage coated with mud and shattered limestone flakes. He knelt to study the passage and saw faint shoe impressions that curved downward as if someone had walked into the dark without hesitation. Archived reports described a missing crew member who vanished near this tunnel during a severe storm in 1978. Search teams found none of his gear, and investigators noted that his last known position matched the location of the old cable cavity. Supervisors later wrote that he had likely slipped into rising runoff waters, then been carried beyond reach. Farhan always wondered why those files lacked detailed maps of the conduit network. He climbed into the passage while the distant knocking faded into a soft, repetitive thud that throbbed like a pulse behind heavy fabric. The air grew colder as he descended, and his flashlight beam caught a rust-colored streak across the left wall that narrowed into thin scratches. The scratches ran parallel for several feet, then split into branching marks that looked frantic and uneven. He recorded the marks and estimated their age based on the flaking debris gathered below them. The dryness of the flakes suggested they had formed many years earlier, yet the upper edges looked freshly chipped, which confused him and made him tighten his grip on the recorder. He walked deeper as the floor leveled and met a small junction space supported by old steel beams that bent slightly inward. He almost stepped on a folded jacket placed neatly near the base of one beam. The fabric was sun-faded and stiff, yet held a faint patch that matched the logo used by track crews in the 70s. Farhan photographed every angle and whispered, "How did it stay dry this long?" even though the recorder picked up the question with a faint crackle. Another passage continued beyond the junction and narrowed into a wedge-shaped corridor that veered under the main tunnel. Farhan followed the path while watching for loose stone that might collapse under his weight. The corridor opened into a circular chamber carved roughly by crews who had once planned to expand drainage culverts, yet abandoned the project due to unstable rock conditions. He swung the flashlight slowly and saw a small pile of objects arranged in a careful ring. The objects included a broken lantern base, a warped set of pliers, and a metal tag that belonged to an older uniform design. None of the pieces looked recent. Yet a single tool lay in the center of the ring with clean edges and bright markings that indicated it had been used within the last week. He reached for the tool and paused when he felt vibrations under his boots that trembled through the chamber in short bursts. He checked his recorder and noted that the microphone captured a low, steady hum originating from the main tunnel. The hum pulsed like machinery, starting and stopping, despite no active equipment scheduled anywhere near this zone. He retreated to the junction and radioed the dispatcher with a brief description of the chamber and collected items. The dispatcher told him that the backup inspector was delayed due to a blocked crossing near the yard, which meant Ferran would need to remain at the site longer than expected. He felt uneasy and decided to exit the passage slowly while documenting each step. As he climbed upward, he heard a faint voice echo from deep below that sounded like a strained attempt to form a short warning. The syllables were unclear, yet carried enough urgency to speed his ascent. He emerged into the alcove and turned toward the main tunnel, where the hum had grown louder at a steady pace. His flashlight shook as he approached the mouth of the tunnel with long, careful strides. A shape moved near the center of the tracks where the darkness thickened. The shape flickered as if caught between the beam of his light and the shadows that clung to the walls. Ferran called out, asking if anyone needed assistance. The shape tilted slightly, then vanished as his beam passed across an empty stretch of rail. He repeated his call with firmer tone and waited for any response. He backed out of the tunnel and reached the open air where the gray sky offered familiar comfort. He steadied his breath and reviewed the footage on his recorder. The display showed faint distortions in the shape of a figure standing at the far end of the tunnel for 2 brief seconds before dissolving into static. The image remained too vague to confirm a person and could not be matched to any known worker silhouette. The second inspector arrived shortly after midday and followed Ferran into the alcove. They documented every detail, then sealed the cavity with reinforced plates ordered through an emergency maintenance request. Company officials later issued a short statement that the old cable routes had collapsed and created misleading impressions of deeper chambers. They ordered that the tunnel section be restricted until further geological checks were completed. Ferran never fully accepted the official explanation because his recorder held the voice fragment that carried a tone of warning rather than pain. Analysts reviewed the audio and concluded that the fragment likely came from echo bounce caused by shifting metal. Yet the cadence and pitch sounded too human and contained subtle dips that suggested controlled breath. Years later, Ferran kept the recorder locked in a metal drawer at his small apartment overlooking service yards. He sometimes played the fragment late at night when freight whistles traveled through the open windows. The voice always repeated the same unclear plea with a slow, trembling rhythm that matched the tapping he had heard on that morning. The quiet truth he often shared with trusted colleagues was simple. He believed that someone trapped deep under the tunnel had used the old cable routes to move toward the alcove, yet never reached the surface. He believed the ring of objects showed an attempt to gather tools for a climb that time eventually stopped. And he believed the final warning on the recording came from someone who wanted future workers to tread carefully in forgotten places where help might never arrive. Ferran understood that not all tunnels hide catastrophic secrets, and not all missing crew stories end with tragedy. Yet he also knew that silence in old service corridors often carries traces of lives that never found closure. When he passed the sealed alcove during later inspections, he paused for a moment of respect and continued down the line, carrying the recorder in his bag with steady, determined steps. You shouldn't ignore footsteps outside that motel balcony. Archived incident notes from a desert county reportedly described repeated complaints about footsteps circling a roadside motel during quiet hours. Those notes mentioned a pattern that centered on a second-floor unit where guests often requested early checkout without offering clear explanations. Rylan Harte was a 34-year-old night clerk at the long-faded Sun Mesa Lodge that sat beside a lonely highway lined with shifting sand and broken fencing. He covered overnight shifts for extra pay and appreciated the slow pace that usually allowed him to read old magazines behind the counter. He walked into the lobby late one spring evening in 2003, expecting another routine shift marked by distant truck engines and a humming soda machine. The plan changed when a nervous traveler named Marcy Bell asked him to switch her from Unit 5 to a room on the opposite side of the building. She claimed she heard steps outside her balcony that matched the steady weight of a full-grown adult walking back and forth without speaking. Rylan studied her tired face and noticed her hands shaking as she held her room key. He reassigned her quickly and decided to check the balcony area after finishing paperwork. He stepped outside with a flashlight and moved along the narrow walkway that wrapped around the motel like a cracked spine. The desert wind carried the smell of dry sage and rumbled lightly against the loose railing. Unit 5 looked ordinary under the dim security bulb that flickered at irregular intervals. Rylan walked slowly and listened for motion in the dirt lot below, but heard only the sigh of passing wind. He knelt near the balcony rail and found a faint line of scuff marks pressed into the dust gathered between concrete and metal. Those marks matched the tread from a rubber sole that had been dragged across the surface with even force. He leaned closer and saw a second pattern that looked narrower and deeper, as if someone had balanced on the edge with careful steps. He photographed the marks with a small disposable camera kept at the front desk for property damage records. Rylan returned to the office and checked older guest logs stored in a creaking cabinet behind the counter. Several entries from the previous winter included notes from guests who mentioned pacing sounds outside their balcony around 2 in the morning. One entry described a slow scrape that traveled from Unit 7 to Unit 5 in a steady rhythm. Another entry stated that the guest felt watched through the curtains but saw no one after turning on the balcony light. He saved those entries and walked back outside near the top of the hour with the intention of remaining quiet while listening for movement. He stopped near Unit 5 and leaned against the warm wall as the wind dropped into a brief stillness that felt unnatural for that region. A faint crunch echoed from the far end of the walkway where a maintenance closet stood, locked behind a warped wooden door. The footsteps moved toward him with deliberate rhythm that pressed weight evenly onto the concrete. The pattern sounded too controlled to be casual wandering. Rylan raised his flashlight and aimed it down the walkway, but saw nothing except dust circling near the railing. He turned the light off and waited in absolute stillness while his pulse thudded against his ribs. The steps resumed and stopped just before reaching him. He felt pressure in the air as if someone stood inches away waiting for a reaction. He turned the light on with a rapid click and revealed an empty walkway stretching toward the dim glow of the lobby bulbs. He checked the railing and found fresh dust disturbed in a long sweeping shape that curved near the corner of the unit. He hurried back to the office and reviewed security footage recorded on a tape-based system that covered only the parking lot and the stairwell. While scanning the stair footage, he noticed a faint blur shape move across the top, landing at the exact time he had heard the footsteps. The blur passed behind the railing, then vanished before reaching the walkway. He rewound the tape and watched it again with the same result. The blur shape had no defined edges and moved with unnatural precision. Rylan contacted the property owner, who lived several towns away, and reported the activity. The owner dismissed the concerns and claimed dust storms often interfered with the old cameras. Rylan insisted that the footsteps were too clear to be wind, yet the owner asked him to finish the shift and write a simple maintenance report. Rylan hung up, feeling unsettled by the lack of concern. He decided to check the walkway again near the second hour past midnight when the earlier logs suggested the most activity occurred. He moved quietly with the flashlight off and leaned close to the railing of Unit 5. The air turned noticeably cooler, as if a pocket of cold had formed from nowhere. He heard slow breathing behind him that did not match the rhythm of wind moving through narrow spaces. He spun around, ready to confront someone, yet again found nothing except his own trembling shadow. He approached the maintenance closet at the far end of the walkway and tested the doorknob, which remained locked. He pressed his ear to the door and heard a faint, rhythmic scrape like fabric dragging across concrete. He stepped back and saw a slight gap beneath the door where dust had been displaced in a straight line that pointed toward the balcony of Unit 5. That discovery made him retreat toward the safety of open space. The breathing sound returned deeper and more labored than before. It came from the walkway behind him with steady tone that suggested someone exhausted yet determined. Rylan refused to turn around and instead walked forward with controlled steps toward the stairwell. The breathing moved beside him, then stopped suddenly, as if the unseen presence had realized he was leaving the area. He reached the bottom of the stairs and watched dust drift from the walkway above as if lifted by a moving body. He raised the flashlight and saw an indentation form in the dust on the upper corner of the balcony, as though a heel had pressed into it with calm pressure. The dust swirled for a brief moment, then settled in stillness. Rylan returned to the office and locked the door while reviewing the security tape again. A new blur appeared near the walkway at the exact moment he sensed the breathing beside him. That blur held a faint outline resembling a full-height figure with one shoulder slumped forward. The tape distorted slightly, then resumed normal clarity after the shape vanished. He checked old maintenance records and found a short report from 1994 describing an incident where a repairman named Garth Lohman slipped from the upper walkway while attempting to fix the flickering security bulb above Unit 5. The report stated that Garth fractured his spine on the railing below and died at a nearby clinic hours later. No follow-up notes explained whether the walkway had been inspected for structural faults. Rylan studied that report and examined the blurred figure again. The slumped shoulder matched the documented injury that Garth had sustained before collapsing. The maintenance closet held equipment he would have used during nightly repairs. The footsteps mirrored patterns of someone pacing while in pain or seeking stability. The next night, Rylan returned to the walkway with intent to document the steps more clearly. He placed 2 sheets of fine dust collection powder in front of Unit 5 and waited in the shadows. The wind remained calm and the motel fell silent except for a distant truck engine passing along the highway. He remained patient until he heard the slow crunch of weight pressing into gravel near the stairwell. The footsteps advanced with steady tempo. The powder shifted under invisible weight and created 2 clear impressions shaped like worn work boots. The impressions pressed deep into the layer, then faded as if the pressure lifted gently. Rylan photographed them quickly, then felt a cold wave pass through him with numbing force that stopped him from speaking. He whispered a short greeting offering help if someone needed guidance. The walkway fell silent until the railing beside him vibrated slightly like a weak attempt to grip it. He watched the dust swirl near the edge and saw a faint slump in the air that seemed to lean forward before dissipating in a slow-motion drift. The next morning, he reviewed the photos and submitted them with a detailed report to the county safety office. Officials visited the property and inspected the walkway while noting that structural wear along the railing had been neglected for years. They ordered immediate repairs and suggested temporary closure of the upper floor. The owner reluctantly complied after seeing the official citation. Rylan stayed with the motel through the renovation and kept the photographs hidden in a small envelope stored under the counter. He often wondered whether the footsteps belonged to someone trying to warn guests of the unstable balcony rather than harm them. He believed Garth might have paced the walkway, seeking another chance to complete the repair that cost him his life. Years later, the renovated motel reopened with brighter lights and stronger railings. Guests no longer reported late-night footsteps or pacing shadows near Unit 5. Yet Rylan sometimes felt a faint pressure of cold air when passing that section of walkway during his rounds. He always whispered a quiet thank you while checking the railing bolts that glimmered under the new lighting. He never felt threatened again. Instead, he sensed a lingering presence that seemed satisfied with the changes and ready to rest beside the quiet winds of the open desert.